In this video, we are going to make corrections to your mini assessment 6, which mainly had to deal with percentages. So let's get started. All right, question 1 was just some basics. How do you get certain percentages? So we need to know, how do we find 10, 20, 50, and 25% of a number? We know that the total will always be 100%. So now we need to figure out, how would you go from the total down to these percentages? To find 10%, we need to think about how many 10% would make 100%. That's right, 10, so we would divide by 10, because we would be, to find 10%, we are making 10 groups, because 100 divided by 10 is 10. All right, to find 20% of a number, we need to think about how many 20s make 100%. 100% divided by what would give us 20%? That's right, it would be 5. All right, now let's think about 50%. The first thing I want you to think about is 50% of something. If you got a 50% on an assignment, what portion of the questions did you get correct? That's right, half. So to find half of something, you would divide by what? That's right, it would be 2, because 2 50% make 100%. All right, now let's try 25% of a number. So I want you to think about, what's another way to say 25%? If 50% is a half, 25% would be, that's right, 1/4. And to get a quarter of something, you would divide by, that's right, it would be 4. Very good. And again, those are what we call our benchmark percentages, meaning those are ones that we should just be able to find quickly. And we use these benchmarks to go to other different percentages. There's another benchmark that's here that we're not going to talk about yet, and that's 1%. All right, let's move on to question 2. Sydney's fitness app says she has completed 70% of her biking goal for the week. Her total goal is 50 miles. How many miles has she biked so far? All right, so we're going to set up a chart. We have our miles and the percentage that matches those miles. All right, so if 50 miles is her total goal, that means 50 miles would be, that's right, 100%, because the total is always 100%. She has biked 70%. And we want to know, how many miles would that be? So thinking here, we cannot go directly from 100% down to 70%. So we need to pick a benchmark to put in the middle. What benchmark would be the best to put in the middle here that we can use to multiply to get to 70%? That's right, it would be 10%. And we know to find 10% of a number, you divide by, that's right, 10. So 50 divided by 10 gives us 5. Now we need to go to 70%. We need to think, how would we go from 10% to 70%? How many 10s make 70? That's right, 7. So we would multiply by 7. 5 times 7 is, you guessed it, 35. So she has biked 35 miles. That would match the 70%. All right, you're going to answer a question similar now, and then we will move on. All right, let's move on to number 3. Zion is reading a 300-page book. He has read 40% of the book so far. How many pages of the book has he read? So, what's going to make another T-chart? We have pages and we have the percentages. All right, so the total of the book is 300 pages. So that is going to match with, that's right, 100%, because that is the total. He has read 40% of the book so far, and we want to know what number of pages will that match. Again, looking here, we cannot go directly from 100% to 40%. So we need to pick a benchmark in the middle. And in this time, our benchmark is going to be, actually, we could use either 10 or 20 in this situation, because 10 and 20 are both multiples, or factors of 40. I'm going to choose 10% though, because it's just, I don't know, it's just easier to find. 10% of 300, if we divide by 10, is, you guessed it, 30. So if, actually I put the 10 divided by 10 in the wrong spot. All right, so if 10% of the book is 30 pages rather, now we need to go to 40%. How many 10% make 40%? That's right, 4. So we're going to multiply now by 4. 30 times 4 is, you guessed it, 120 pages. So if he has read 40% of the book, he has read 120 pages. All right, now you're going to answer a similar question and then we'll move on. All right, let's move on to question 4. Amari has painted 12 feet of a 20-foot fence. What percent of the fence has she painted? All right, so we had, to set up our T-chart, we have the amount of feet painted and we have a percentage. Since the total amount of the fence is 20 feet, that is going to be 100% because it is the total length of the fence. We want 12 feet because that's the percentage that we're looking for. So now here I need to think about, how would I go from 20 down to 12? You cannot do that directly because 12 is not a factor or multiple of 20. So what we need to do is find a benchmark in the middle. I'm going to use, in this case, you could actually, again, here use a couple different ones. Again, always start with 10% though. It's just the easiest one to do. If I divide this by 10, I know that it would be 2 feet would be 10%, because 20 divided by 10 is 2. So now I need to think about, can I use that to get to 12? And yes, I can. Think about how many 10s make 12. That is right, 6 of them. So 10% times 6 is 60%. So he has painted 60% of the fence. Again, I did not mean to highlight that whole box. If 20 feet is 100%, that means that 2 feet is 10%, and then use that to multiply by 6 to go to 12 feet, which is what we are looking for, and that is 60%. All right, you are going to answer a similar question now. All right, and let's head to our next question. Ava bought shoes that were on sale for 30% off the regular price. If Ava saved $12, what was the original price of the shoes? All right, so let's set up our T-chart. We have a price, and we have the percentage. All right, so $12, we need to figure out what percentage would that represent. Is that the total cost of the shoes, or is it the portion of the cost? That is correct. 12 is only a portion of the cost. The $12 is what she saved, which was 30%. We are looking for the original price, which would be 100%. All right, we cannot go from 30 to 100% directly, so we need to pick a benchmark for the middle. We need to think, what benchmark can I divide 30 by or multiply, and then also use to get 100? That's right, 10%. If $12 is 30%, how would I go down to 10%? That's right, divide by 3. $12 divided by 3 is $4. So $4 is 10%, but we want the total cost, so we want to go to 100%. think about how many 10% make 100%. That's right, 10. So now we are going to multiply by 10. $4 times 10 is $40. So $40 would make 100%. All right, you will now answer a question similar. I did it again. And then we will move on. All right, time for our final question. What is 8% of 40? So this is a little bit of a different one because we need to use a new benchmark that we have talked about before. So we have a number and we have a percentage. 40 is our total. That's the number we're working with. And we know that that matches with 100%. However, we want 8%. Let's work down with our benchmarks. If 40 is 100%, we're going to go to 10%. So what would 100% divided by 10 is 10%. So 40 divided by 4 is 4. Divided by 10 is 4. So that means 4 is equal to 10%. However, that is not helpful still to go to 8%. So let's keep going with this. We're going to go now down to 1%. That is another benchmark that we know. To go from 10% to 1%, that's right, we're going to divide by 10 again. So we need to think about what would 4 divided by 10 be? That is right, it would be equal to 4/10 or 0.4. Now we're going to use that 1% to go to 8%. 1% times 8 gives us 8%. So now we need to think about 0.4 times 8%. First, take out the decimal. We know that 4 times 8 gives us, that's correct, 32. So now we need to think about the decimal point here. If there is one decimal, one place after the decimal in our factor, there is going to be one place after the decimal in our product. So instead of 32, it's going to be 3.2. So 3 2/10 is 8% of 40. So that means like if something was $40 and then had an 8% tax, you would be adding $3.20 to it. All right, and that can, so first you're going to answer a similar question. All right, that concludes our video. I hope that this was helpful and will get you some points back on your mini assessment grade. We will talk next time.